The man who faced death and wrote his way into immortality. Imagine this. You're standing in a freezing courtyard, hands tied behind your back. The cold wind bites at your face, but that's nothing compared to the terror clawing at your chest. You've been sentenced to death. The guards are ready. The rifles are loaded. There's no escape, no appeals, no miracle coming. A priest walks by, offering last rites. The man next to you is trembling uncontrollably. Another whispers a final prayer. You, however, are frozen not by the cold, but by the realization that these are the last seconds of your life. In a moment, you'll be nothing more than a body in the snow. And then, the unthinkable happens. The execution is halted. A messenger rides in, announcing the Tsar's mercy. Your death sentence is commuted to years of hard labor in a Siberian prison. You've been spared, but you're no longer free. The man you were is gone. That man was Fyodor Dostoevsky, a young writer whose ideas had brought him both hope and ruin. He would spend years in chains, sleeping on wooden planks among criminals and killers, battling illness and despair. And yet, out of this darkness, he would emerge to create some of the most profound and influential works in all of literature. This is not just the story of a writer. It's the story of a man who stood face to face with death and then learned how to live.
Chapter 1. From Shadows of Childhood to the Brink of Death. Long before Fyodor Dostoevsky stood in that frozen square, he was just a boy in Moscow, a boy who learned too early that life was both fragile and merciless. Born in 1821, the second of 7 children, his earliest memories were shaped by contrasts, moments of warmth at his family's small home on the grounds of the Mariinsky Hospital for the Poor, and the constant presence of suffering just beyond their doorstep. His father, Mikhail Dostoevsky, was a military doctor, a stern, rigid man whose discipline could border on cruelty. He believed in hard work, strict order, and the unbending authority of the patriarch. His mother, Maria, was the opposite, gentle, devout, and patient, always trying to shield her children from their father's temper. She nurtured Fyodor's love of reading, filling his world with fairy tales and biblical stories, and encouraging his curiosity about the human soul. But the hospital grounds were no place for innocent dreams. Fyodor grew up watching sick, broken, and desperate people pass by their windows every day. The sight of human misery became a part of his reality, and it left a deep imprint on his young mind. He began to notice the smallest details in people's faces, the way fear, hope, and despair could coexist in the same expression. That sensitivity would later define his writing. Then tragedy struck. In 1837, when Fyodor was just 15, his mother died of tuberculosis. Her loss was a blow from which he never truly recovered. Soon after, his father sent him and his older brother Mikhail to the Nikolaev Military Engineering Academy in St. Petersburg. It wasn't a choice, it was an order. For Fyodor, the academy was suffocating. He wasn't a soldier at heart. The days were long, the training harsh, and the cold military discipline crushed his spirit. He found solace only in books. He devoured the works of Shakespeare, Schiller, and especially Pushkin, whose ability to reveal deep human emotions struck him like lightning. At night, while others slept, Fyodor would write. Scraps of stories, fragments of dialogue, attempts to capture the raw truth of human nature. But tragedy would visit again. In 1839, news came that his father had died suddenly on their small country estate. The official cause was apoplexy, but rumors spread that he had been murdered by his own serfs, driven to rage by his harsh treatment. Whether the story was true or not, it haunted Dostoevsky for the rest of his life. Some historians believe that the shadow of that rumor, the image of an oppressive man destroyed by those beneath him, influenced Dostoevsky's later obsession with guilt, redemption, and the darker impulses of the human soul. By 1843, he had graduated from the academy as an engineer, but his heart wasn't in the profession. He resigned within a year, choosing instead the uncertain path of a writer. His first major work, Poor Folk, published in 1846, was a breakthrough. Critics hailed him as a new voice in Russian literature, a writer who could capture the struggles of ordinary people with empathy and precision. But fame did not bring stability. Dostoevsky was drawn to the Petrashevsky Circle, a group of intellectuals who met in secret to discuss banned books, philosophy, and ideas of social reform. In Tsarist Russia, such gatherings were dangerous. The government saw them as seeds of revolution. In April 1849, his life changed forever. Dostoevsky and other members of the group were arrested, accused of conspiracy against the state. They were thrown into the Peter and Paul Fortress, a grim prison where the air was damp, the cells were dark, and the uncertainty of their fate was suffocating. For 8 months he waited, not knowing if he would be freed or executed. Then came that fateful December morning. The prisoners were taken from their cells, lined up in a snowy square, and told they were about to be shot. Dostoevsky watched as the first 3 men were tied to posts, blindfolded. He was in the next group. He had minutes, maybe seconds, left to live. And then, at the very last moment, the Tsar's pardon was read aloud. The death sentence was replaced with 4 years of hard labor in Siberia, followed by mandatory military service. It was a cruel trick, a staged execution meant to break their spirits. But for Dostoevsky, it became the turning point of his life. In the space of a heartbeat, he had gone from the certainty of death to the long road of survival.
Chapter 2. Siberia. In the company of the condemned. The journey to Siberia was a slow descent into another world, one colder, harder, and more merciless than anything Dostoevsky had known. Shackled at the wrists and ankles, he traveled with other prisoners for weeks across endless snow-covered plains. The winds were sharp enough to cut skin, and the cold seeped into the bones. Every night they slept in freezing barracks or under the open sky, guarded by armed soldiers who looked at them as if they were less than human. When they finally arrived in Omsk, Dostoevsky saw his new home, a crumbling wooden fortress surrounded by high walls and guarded watchtowers. Inside, the barracks were overcrowded, filthy, and suffocating. There were no beds, just planks of wood where men lay packed shoulder to shoulder. The stench of sweat, unwashed bodies, and disease was constant. Lice and fleas covered everything. His fellow prisoners were not petty criminals. Most were murderers, thieves, or soldiers punished for violent mutiny. Many had faces hardened by years of cruelty and survival. At first, they saw Dostoevsky, a thin, pale intellectual, as an outsider. Some mocked him, others ignored him. The work was relentless. In the dead of winter, they hauled heavy loads of bricks, dug in the frozen earth, and carried timber until their hands bled. Meals were meager: stale bread, watery soup, sometimes nothing at all. The cold burned the skin, and frostbite was a constant threat. And yet, something unexpected happened. Slowly, Dostoevsky began to understand the men around him. He listened to their stories of poverty, of betrayal, of crimes committed in rage or desperation. Many were brutal, yes, but some were simply broken by life. He realized that even in the darkest hearts, there could be moments of kindness, flashes of humanity. This was the seed of what would later become one of Dostoevsky's greatest gifts as a writer, the ability to portray even the most flawed characters with empathy. He did not excuse their crimes, but he sought to understand them. His time in Siberia also changed his beliefs. Before prison, he had been drawn to progressive utopian ideals. He believed that society could be remade through reason and equality. But in the freezing darkness of Omsk, he began to think differently. He saw that suffering was inseparable from human existence, and that true change came not from abstract theories, but from the transformation of the individual soul. There was another blow. In prison, Dostoevsky developed severe epilepsy. His first seizure came without warning, and it terrified both he and those around him. These attacks would plague him for the rest of his life, shaping his sense of human vulnerability and finding their way into his novels through characters who suffered the same affliction. 4 years passed like this, a mixture of back-breaking labor, illness, and moments of silent reflection. When he was finally released in 1854, he was not free. He was sent to serve as a soldier in a remote Siberian regiment, but something inside him had changed forever. The man who entered the Omsk fortress was a young writer with ideals and ambitions. The man who walked out was someone who had looked into the abyss and chosen to keep living. Years later, he would write to his brother about the moment after the staged execution, saying, "Life is a gift. Life is happiness. Every minute could be an eternity of happiness." It was not a naive statement. It came from someone who had seen death, lived among the condemned, and understood how fragile every breath could be.
Chapter 3. Return to the World, Creation, and the Weight of Fate. When Dostoevsky was finally allowed to return to European Russia in 1859, he was a man transformed. But freedom was not the kind of romantic liberation one might imagine. He returned to a city that had moved on without him. His old literary circles had dissolved, publishers were cautious to work with an ex-convict, and the weight of his criminal record still shadowed him. He was 38, penniless, and still marked by the deep lines of hardship. His health was fragile, his epilepsy unpredictable. Yet inside him burned a fierce determination, a hunger not only to write again, but to write as if every sentence could be his last. Love and Loss. Upon his return, Dostoevsky fell deeply in love with Maria Dmitrievna Isaeva, a widow he had met years earlier in Siberia. Their marriage, in 1857, before he even left military service, was one of passion, but also tragedy. Maria was gravely ill with tuberculosis, and their life together was marked by poverty, constant relocations, and her declining health. Dostoevsky cared for her with loyalty, even as he battled his own illnesses and financial instability. Her death in 1864 was a crushing blow, made even heavier by the death of his beloved brother Mikhail the same year. Dostoevsky inherited Mikhail's debts with his own, a financial avalanche that would push him into one of the most destructive habits of his life, gambling. The grip of the roulette wheel.
In 1863, Dostoevsky discovered roulette tables in Germany, and the thrill of sudden wins and devastating losses gripped him completely. There was something about the spinning wheel, the chaos, the risk, the illusion of control that mirrored the intensity of his own inner life. Many times he gambled away his last rubles, even pawning clothes and belongings. Letters to friends during these years are filled with desperate pleas for loans, apologies for unpaid debts, and grand promises to repay as soon as the next novel is finished. But the roulette wheel also taught him something about the human condition, about temptation, despair, and the strange hope that keeps a man returning to the table even after ruin. Those lessons became flesh and blood in his characters, the desperate gamblers, the obsessive lovers, the morally conflicted heroes who populate his novels. Anna and Salvation. In 1866, Dostoevsky faced an impossible deadline. His publisher demanded a novel in just 26 days, or the rights to all his future works would be forfeited. Desperate, he hired a young stenographer, Anna Grigorievna Snitkina. They worked day and night to produce The Gambler, a thinly veiled account of his own addiction. Anna was 20 years younger, but unlike many in his life, she saw not just the flaws, but the greatness in him. They married in 1867, and she became not only his wife, but his savior in practical matters. Anna took over his finances, shielding him from creditors and managing his affairs with a precision that allowed him to focus on writing. Under her care, Dostoevsky entered the most productive period of his life. From their modest home, often in exile abroad to escape debts, he produced the works that would define him and Russian literature. Crime and Punishment, 1866. The Idiot, 1869. Demons, 1872. The Brothers Karamazov, 1880. Philosophy and Legacy. These novels were more than stories. They were philosophical battlegrounds where faith, morality, suffering, and redemption collided. Dostoevsky's characters were not flat symbols. They breathed, suffered, and struggled like the real people he had known in prison, in the gambling halls, and on the streets of St. Petersburg. He believed that true freedom could only come through moral responsibility, and that suffering, though bitter, was often the path to spiritual awakening. His life was living proof of that belief. The man who had once faced a mock execution now poured every drop of his hard-won wisdom into his art. In 1880, at the public unveiling of the Pushkin Monument in Moscow, Dostoevsky delivered a speech that moved the crowd to tears. He spoke of unity, compassion, and the shared humanity of the Russian people. It was the voice of a man who had seen darkness but still believed in light. Only 6 months later, in January 1881, Dostoevsky died at the age of 59, surrounded by his family. Thousands attended his funeral, honoring a man who had been condemned, humiliated, and broken, but who rose again to shape the soul of a nation's literature. If you look closely at Dostoevsky's life, you realize this: he was never saved by someone else. No powerful benefactor erased his debts. No miracle erased his suffering. What carried him was his refusal to surrender to the darkness, a will to keep creating no matter how many times life stripped him bare. And maybe that's the greatest lesson his life leaves us. No one is coming to save you, but if you keep moving forward, even through the deepest night, you might just save yourself.